text of Scripture that I'm going to preach on this morning is the Ten Commandments, but I thought I would put them in the order of service the way John Calvin would. Once we have heard that we are forgiven for our sins, and then once we have sung praises to God, we are prepared to listen to God's instruction so that we will not be in error again. Hear these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, not you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. I think it's fair to say that our society has kind of lost its moral way. I mean, maybe it's a little too much to hope for that we'll all love each other, but it seems to me like we're expressing more contempt for each other than anything else. It's happening all over the world, really. It's not just us here in America. But it does seem to me as though the world needs to attend to ethical living. And to the degree the church or the Judeo-Christian tradition can help them, we're going to need the Ten Commandments. We're going to need to focus on them, I believe. But of course, that's going to be a hard sell in the world. Because over the years, the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition has distorted those commandments. I mean, sometimes it just seems to get ridiculous. You just want to hem people in, and they're an opportunity to make people feel guilty instead of an opportunity to help people grow. Take the don't use the name of the Lord your God in vain. That's really about magic more than anything else. But, that's turned into don't use naughty language. And yet Steve just read a passage from Paul's letter to the Philippians where Paul used some caustic language. I mean, the translation he used said rubbish. All right, I count it all rubbish. The King James is more honest. It says, I count it all dung. What is that exactly? There are times when we just distort the Ten Commandments and make them, just seem like priggish rules instead of being an opportunity to grow and develop. We've mucked it up. So let's take a fresh look at these Ten Commandments and see if we might get something a little different mood from them, some way to move forward in society with them. Now, the first thing I want you to remember about the Ten Commandments is that they are in Exodus chapter 20, not in Exodus chapter 1. I mentioned this in Bible class one night. It's really important. I mean, if the Ten Commandments were in Exodus chapter 1, the story would be different. It would have meant that God looked down on the suffering of God's people enslaved in Egypt and said to himself, I know what I'll do. I'll give them 10 rules. If they follow those, then I'll save them. But that is not what God did. God looked down on the suffering of God's people enslaved in Egypt, and God saved them from the Egyptian Pharaoh, brought them to the mountain where God could then speak, and helped to form them in a community. See, slaves don't really understand how to rule themselves. It takes a long time to figure that out. And so in this story, God gave the gift of law and instruction to the people of Israel so that they could become a whole and complete community, a light on the hill, a group of people that could show you what life is like when it's led in concert with the love of God. So the 10 Commandments come in that context. Grace comes first and continues to come with the offering of law. But there are only 10 of them. And what they really are is sort of fence posts in a fence that surrounds and puts boundaries around the nature of a community. It's not unlike the U.S. Constitution. I took a class at Sarah Lawrence once years ago from a guy named Jack Niels. He was a very famous New York lawyer. He'd argued cases before the Supreme Court and so on. And he felt that a liberal arts education should include courses in the law, and he really did not want pre-law students in his class. That was not the point. So we studied labor law with him. And that might seem very dull and dry, and I suppose to a point it was, but really what happened is he showed us how the law works, that we start with the Constitution. Congress then adds laws, and then the Supreme Court starts to interpret them. And over time, an entire body of law, an interpretation, an understanding of how it all fits together would begin to emerge. It's how things work with our Constitution in courts at their best. And it's how things are intended to work with these 10 fence posts, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. So we look to interpret them, but that brings up 2 problems. The first problem is that every one of us is, to one degree or another, enslaved ourselves. We're not enslaved to an Egyptian pharaoh, but we are enslaved to a false self-image. Paul would have called it the flesh, that is developed as a way when we were young to just kind of make sense of the stuff that was going on around us. And it builds up and it distorts. My wife and I do a process where we ask people to kind of boil that down to one sentence. You know, a sentence about yourself that's false, but that somehow you manage to order your life around it. Mine happens to be, I'm not enough. I'm just never feel like I'm enough when I'm in that false self-image. Others have ideas like, I'm all alone. But we are enslaved to some degree or another, and because of that, we can distort our interpretation of the commandments. If we have an image of ourselves as a grand success, well, then we can justify lying to other people to keep that image up. So we are enslaved, and therefore it's difficult for us to interpret the laws of the 10 Commandments. I suppose we could go to authorities, to others, to churchmen and women, except that that is ripe for abuse. Because then you get a situation where people who are in power will distort the interpretation of the law to keep themselves in a place that's on a pedestal or keep themselves into power. So the problem here is that God's given us 10 commandments that need to be interpreted. But we are enslaved if we interpret them alone, and we are enslaved if we rely upon an authority to tell us exactly what they mean. What are we to do? Well, the answer comes in the first table of the law, in those first few commandments. They start out with wanting to get your relationship with the presence of God right. Because once that relationship is right, Once you are responding ethically to the love that is welling up within you, well, then you can interpret and see clearly what those commandments and laws are all about. The goal is to live out, not out of fear and guilt, but to live ethically as a response to the love of God that moves within us and expands beyond us. It's as though the love of God flows into our hearts and overflows in the way that we treat other people. That's the goal. Not to say that we can't seek other sources to try and figure things out. That's what the psalmists would do. That's what the wisdom literature does in the book of Proverbs. I mean, well over half of the Proverbs that are in the Hebrew Bible can be found in other Near East sources that have nothing to do with the Hebrew religion. You can find other ways, but always done within the presence of the love of God. One of the places that I go and look, it's kind of funny sometimes, is the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, the Westminster Confession of Faith was written in the 15th century. And in the 15th century, that was the height of the, there we go, that was the height of the Reformation. And a group got together, they're called the Westminster Divines, and they wrote the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Shorter and Longer Catechism. My Uncle Richard, a church history professor of some note at Gordon Conwell Seminary, used to tell us that the Westminster Divines were surer of some things than God himself. It feels that way, especially with the tone. Let me just read you a little bit about what they say about thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And remember, this is not authoritative, but it is input as we decide what this pillar or this post represents. What are the duties required at the 9th commandment? Well, the duties required are the preserving and the promoting of truth between man, and the good name of our neighbor as well as our own good name. Appearing and standing for truth, and from the heart sincerely, freely and clearly and fully, speaking the truth and only the truth in matters of judgment and justice, and in all other things whatsoever. It means having a charitable esteem of our neighbors, loving, desiring, and rejoicing in their good name, sorrowing for and covering of their infirmities, freely acknowledging their gifts and graces, defending their innocency, a ready receiving of a good report. I've only read half. And what might the sins be that are forbidden? Well, all prejudicing of the truth and the good name of our neighbors as well as our own, giving false evidence, suborning witnesses, wittingly appearing and pleading for an evil cause, outfacing and overbearing the truth, passing unjust sentence, calling evil good and good evil. You get the idea, I would imagine. It's a big, big commandment. And it covers a lot of ground. And Westminster's an interesting place to go to get the scope of that ground as we meditate ourselves on the law and what it might mean. But you know, the Buddhists make this one simple. They say when you speak, everything you say should be true, kind, and necessary. That's going to sum up Westminster pretty well. When my wife first told me that, I used to tease her. I'd say, you know, I really can do probably 2 out of 3, but I don't know about 3 out of 3. But the reality is that if we are focused and if we practice saying only things that are true, kind, and necessary, it changes the nature of our relationships with one another. Of course, we can't do that unless we are expressing the love that is welling up within us. It's been hard to watch as people have taken this commandment and destroyed it these last years in our polarized society. And so we're called to focus and practice ethical living. It's part of what a Christian life really is. But it takes effort. It takes an effort to be in the presence of God and to think through what you really believe is right and wrong. It's often good to do that with friends who love and understand us. But let's take this one step deeper. Let's go backwards to the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not steal. What are the duties, asks Westminster, required in the 8th commandment? Well, they are truth and faithfulness and justice in contracts and commerce between people, rendering to everyone his due, restitution of goods unlawfully detained from the right owners thereof, giving and lending freely, according to our abilities and the necessities of others, moderation of judgments, wills, and affections concerning worldly goods, a provident care and study to get, keep, use, and dispose of things which are necessary and convenient for the sustentation of our nature and suitable to our condition. A lawful calling, diligence in it, frugality, avoiding unnecessary lawsuits. I've only covered about half of it. If you think about this commandment, you realize that every one of us inevitably is breaking it. We are not living ethically. We can't. We are embedded in a society that is not living ethically. Our entire economic system has become distorted and pulled apart, and people are not being treated with fairness, given what their ability might be. That's the nature of things. It's why God gives God's law, to help us come together as a society. But my point here is that this is not about whether or not you're good or bad. This is not about whether you're ethical or unethical. This is about instruction, so that each one of us knows where we're going and how to help the people around us get there. It's what Christians do. We meditate on the law. We seek to understand the direction we'd like to see society go. And we trust God that there will be many, many of us, that God will speak within our hearts and a new kind of society can emerge. You've heard me many times talk about the three things that happen during an evolutionary move, during a moment of growth. But where it starts is when a system is stressed and devolving, and that's where we are right now. And that means this is a perfect opportunity for you and I to address our own hearts, to do our own kind of investigation, always connecting to the love that's welling up within us, but then speaking with kindness and truth what is necessary to help our society grow and reflect the love of God that's creating it. That's our hope. That's what we have to offer the world. Let's do it.